this evening's lecture, we're going to talk about strategic dissonance. So that's a very peculiar topic. And I'd like to focus on this particular paper of the same title by Burgelman and Grove. For those of you who are probably not aware, so this is anti-Grove, okay, of Intel fame. Okay? And even if it's quite a dated paper, I think the ideas behind this paper is still very useful even for today. In particular, when we talk about technology strategy or technology selection. Okay. Now, to begin, the whole idea here is that when we try to align corporate strategy and action, strategic action, we know that to be one of top management's responsibility. That's quite clear. Everybody knows that, okay, they have to align, okay, this is the plan, this is the path, this is what we do. Okay, and you'd expect top management to be that main driver or main protagonist here. Now, in most cases, okay, foresight or having that ability to anticipate can, of course, always be assumed to explain successful strategies after the fact. So whenever we try to look at the outcomes after certain decisions have been made, more often than not, we would try to attribute it to the ability of the leaders' anticipation or foresight or very careful planning, in simpler terms. Okay? And more often than not, that is probably correct. Now, whenever we look in technology industries, particularly high-tech industries, there has been convincing evidence, especially up to now, that that's not always the case. The point being is that it's not enough for you to anticipate certain things in order for you to be successful, but there's something more. So the dilemma right now, at least by these authors, by Burgelman and Grove, is if extraordinary foresight is unavailable or is not enough, how can management really make strategic decisions in circumstances of technology, like high-tech industries? Now, they start off with a premise. And this is one of three concepts that we will learn in today's lecture. And the first concept would be the premise, the part of the premise, is that in extremely dynamic industries, okay, the alignment between intent and action doesn't last long. And we can understand that because we know that any technology, especially high technology, its rate of evolution is quite high. Things keep on changing. Therefore, what you have thought of perhaps last month or last year may not be applicable now, or may not be applicable 1 year from now. So the time that you spend trying to plan, ruminate, whatever approach that you want to do, based in that period, when you fast forward it, let's say to 1 year from now or 6 months from now, that's no longer applicable. Certain assumptions would not be correct anymore. Okay? Bottom line is, that way of doing things, that way of coming up with a strategy and the appropriate execution of your strategy does not work in high-tech industries. Now, inevitably, strategic actions will lead to, or begin to lead or lag strategic intent. Okay. There's going to be some misalignment. In that situation, it's known as strategic dissonance. So dissonance meaning the intent, what you want to happen versus what's going to work, what's going to happen, doesn't match. Now, the claim of the authors here is that whenever there's new strategic intent, it is always going to be based on management's ability or capacity to take advantage of conflicting information generated by strategic dissonance. So at this point, it's not enough that management has foresight, that management has the ability to anticipate certain things. Okay? But rather, it's also dependent on management's ability, okay, skills, competencies to be comfortable with conflicts, with tensions, with whatever it is that's made available to them at that point in time. And that skill is really important in the case of high technology industries. So the first notion here about strategic dissonance, well, the first thing that we want to come up here or want to establish is to acknowledge that there is such a thing as strategic dissonance, okay? Especially when we're dealing with technology. Now, we start off with the current landscape. Immediately, we know that dissonance is not a new idea. I mean, it happens, but not all dissonance is necessarily strategic in nature. It could be tactical, it could be operational, and a lot of these things happen. Dissonance perhaps might not be the word that we would use, but we know that there could be conflicts or tensions or stresses in certain realities. That happens anywhere we go. However, not everything can be attributed as strategic dissonance. So companies routinely experience some level of tension as a result of disagreements, differences in opinions, because as we know how organizations are structured, they're not perfect. There's no perfect model. Even if you drill it down at the level of the sector or industry, there is no perfect model for an industry, right? And we know for a fact that no project ever unfolds exactly as planned. So for those of you who are aware or have some knowledge about project management, back in the old days, you'd have this measure known as the CPI or the SPI, right? The cost performance index, the schedule performance index. It's rarely 1.0. So what was planned is what was executed. That doesn't happen. What was forecasted to be spent is the same thing that was spent. No, it doesn't happen that way. So, and that happens. I mean, the fact that these things happen means that the idea of dissonance is not a new thing. Okay, and companies need managers precisely to mediate and resolve these types of frictions. Now, of course, one can argue that sometimes the managers are the source of these frictions or source of these tensions. Okay, but perhaps that is discussion for another time. But the main textbook here is well, that's why you need managers. They're really there to help smoothen things out. Okay. Now, strategic dissonance becomes pertinent when it signals what? Impending industry or corporate transformation. So if an evolution or certain change is going to happen at a much bigger level, at the very least at the company level, or even bigger, at industry level, then that's where strategic dissonance becomes relevant. Now, the second idea or the second notion described by the authors is what is known as strategic inflection point, or the SIP. Now, you might have seen the concept of the inflection point in previous presentations regarding the S-curve. As you know, the S-curve would have an inflection point in between. Okay? And the inflection point is actually a term that you probably have first encountered in math, okay, wherein the rate of change slowly changes from positive to negative or from negative to positive. But in the parlance of management or leadership, it can mean one of many descriptions. It could mean a giving way of one type of industry dynamics to another. So how things operated before in the past, if it's going to change now, that is an inflection point. Okay? At that moment, wherein how things were managed before, now you are starting to experience a different way of doing things. That moment, it's so hard to pinpoint that, but that moment, whatever that moment is an inflection point. Okay? Another description would be if there is a change from one winning strategy to another. So if you've decided that how we've done things in the past, we change it completely. So at that point where if that decision has been made, Maybe you can identify the date or the time or wherever, but whatever that point is, that is another example of a strategic inflection point. Now, what's another description? Well, the replacement of an existing technological regime by a new one. Okay? And perhaps this is more commonly seen in the S-curves, the technological S-curves that we've seen in other presentations. But same idea, that point is actually considered an inflection point. Now, the thing here is that this is just an abstract notion, right? If you take a look at the S-curves, if you take a look at technological changes and the likes, these are all abstract, right? There's no rigorous mathematical way to predict that, okay, we are going to move away from an inflection point. Or next week, we will go to an inflection point. And then after next week, the week after, okay, we'll have a different path altogether. That doesn't happen that way, okay? It's hard to predict, yes. But the thing there is that the general feel of that situation, okay, might give you an idea that, okay, I'm approaching an inflection point. And in fact, strategic dissonance signals a strategic inflection point. So we now know that whenever an organization recognizes that it's in a dissonance situation or strategic dissonance situation, more likely than not, they are experiencing an inflection point. Now, hold that thought for a moment, and then you can probably look at it in this way, right? For example, the left side would be the old, the right side would be the new. Okay, so there's profitable growth at some point in time. Okay, but you notice that as years go by, as time goes by, you don't seem to reap as much benefit or as much sales, as much profit as they used to from the previous year, from the previous period. Okay, and this sensation, this feeling starts to become more palpable whenever we feel that there's not much gains to be reaped. Okay, you notice that, oh no, it's so little, you know. It's at that moment where you probably are aware, but not in this construct, that you're aware that you're in that moment of truth. Okay, maybe you call it a moment of truth. You're in this point of no return, so to speak. You probably have different names for it. Well, another name for that, at least for our intellectual apparatus, is known as the strategic inflection point. Okay. Now, what happens during the strategic inflection point? If nothing happens, then of course, if things have been deteriorating, then deterioration will continue. But if you recognize that the deterioration will continue, that's also a good opportunity for you to change, okay, so that you can really make things happen, and then the survivability of the organization is maintained. Either way, whatever the outcome would be, that particular point is an inflection point. So in that sense, when an organization feels that there's something dissonant, as far as strategic dissonance is concerned, okay, that inflection point will be there. And I think it's one thing for us to appreciate that, okay, we're at an inflection point. Okay, now it's either you do something about it or you don't. If you don't, then bad things might happen. If you do something about it, well, hopefully good things will happen, but you have to do something. Okay. Now, unfortunately, it is very difficult for anyone, especially in an industry like high-tech industries, to really be able to see that, okay, we're now at this inflection point. We have a deadline. Tomorrow is the inflection point. If we don't do anything, the following day will die. Again, it's not that hard science, right? There's really no way for you to determine that. Okay? Now, that poses a very good question. Now, how can management know when dissonance is strategic, as opposed to something that's just minor or a transitory change in the dynamic strategy or technology? So now we realize that certain tensions do exist. Now we ask ourselves, is that tension really, properly speaking, strategic dissonance? or it's probably something else. Because consider the possibility that that's strategic dissonance, right? And you made some major changes in your organization. And then, lo and behold, it's not strategic dissonance. It was just some change, something minor. Now, that might be a disadvantage to you because you've probably invested a lot of time, energy, effort to apply the action in relation to what you thought was strategic dissonance, but it's not, right? That could mean a waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of resources, right? Now, on the other hand, you are also running the risk that you might think it's just a minor tension, but it might be a real bad situation, right? So how do you know? How do you make that prudent decision or prudent assessment to say that, okay, this is really a strategic inflection point, or nah, this is significant, yes, but we don't have to change anything with our strategy. We will hold the fort, we continue as planned. Okay. Now, one way to determine that with a certain level of certainty is to learn to sense things. So back in the old days, when this was written, they were thinking about the voices of other people. But in the current literature now, at least in the 2020s, one of the talents or one of the required skill set of any leader is the ability to do sense making, or the ability to sense things from the ground. And in this case, it's a similar idea. Okay? When you are faced with a strategic inflection point, okay, leaders should be able to sense something from the ground, in particular from those who are actually out there. Specifically, these voices can come from your other managers below you, or even down from the rank and file level. Okay? And when you do the proper sense making, you will get that appreciation that, hey, something is afoot, something is going to happen really big. Okay? And you get to hear that. Okay? Obviously, if everybody else in your organization is not voicing out the same concern across all the levels, right? Then probably the dissonance that you're experiencing is not yet strategic. But that can be argued still that perhaps they didn't know any better, or they're not as open as they would be because of lack of psychological safety, etc. But assuming things are working well within the organization, if the leader senses across the organization that things are a little bit okay, they're saying something, okay, and then you go to another person, they're saying the same things, okay, and you're feeling uncomfortable about it. Oh, why are they all saying this? But I don't seem to see it. Then okay, maybe that's your moment of truth. Maybe you are now in that strategic inflection point. So what are examples of these voices that bubble up, right, from the organization as a whole? Well, from people that know more because they spend time at the field. So they have good external understanding. And don't be surprised. Sometimes leaders, unless they really build that habit to be externally oriented, a lot of the leaders that we have right now, sometimes because of for legitimate reasons, they tend to be very internal looking as well. Perhaps the organization is not really doing well, so they probably want to focus their time and energy to fix the internals. But because of that, because they're human beings, they don't have time to consider the externals. Okay. They spend time outdoors, and then they also are able to question certain assumptions about the field. Okay. Perhaps there is this so-called wisdom that, okay, back then you're holding this nugget of wisdom, but too many anecdotes start to disprove that wisdom already. So you can see it, and then you're sort of, but this doesn't seem to be what we were trained to do. Okay, for example, right? So maybe no, that's one opportunity that that would give you to have that impression that, okay, we're now in a strategic inflection point. In fact, some of them would probably flag their management. Somebody would really raise it, okay? Oh, this competitor, these competitors, plural, they're doing a lot of these things now. I mean, and we're not doing it yet. So why? No? Or this set of clients, diba? They're asking for this particular thing, but we're not even doing anything about this thing. We're not even reviewing this technology. Right? For example, you have a lot of clients looking into Internet of Things, but you yourself, you're not doing Internet of Things. Or they're into augmented reality, but we're not thinking about augmented reality. So maybe you'd hear that from people raising these things. And sometimes, because people are concerned with other things, you will notice that some of the other leaders, the middle managers in particular, would start to do their own thing already. So you have a lot of side projects that are existing. And then as leaders, you probably think, okay, I don't recall this to be part of our general plan, but you see a lot of people, especially the middle managers, they're pushing initiatives that I haven't foreseen as a leader myself. Oh no, what does this tell me? Okay, why are you looking into this or looking into that? Okay, so maybe that is also another moment that you're reaching a strategic inflection point. Now, with all that, knowing that strategic dissonance exists and the notion of a strategic inflection point, while abstract, is a good point for us to identify along the way, the third notion comes into the picture, and that's where the need for strategic recognition is important. So managing strategic dissonance requires strategic recognition. Okay, so what is strategic recognition? It is the capacity of top managers to appreciate the strategic importance of managerial initiatives. Okay, so here's the tense part. After they have come about, but before the environmental feedback is available. So it's a little bit tense, right? Strategic recognition, you can see that people already are starting to move into certain directions, but the environment as a whole isn't ripe enough to actually go into that direction. So it's like advance notice, no? And you started to feel that advance, not only feel, you get to see that advance notice, but then everybody else hasn't really acted on it. Now, for you to identify those types of events or phenomena, that's strategic recognition. Now, strategic recognition is really happening in three stages, right? And okay, so let's go through these three stages. The first one is recognizing the growing divergence between what the company currently puts forth as its strategy, so the original plan, and the actions taken by its managers. So you have an original plan. Okay, you had this plan, you cascaded it, you announced it, but then everybody else at the bottom started to do their own thing. So that is what we call strategic dissonance as well, right? Now, the second stage would be once you recognize that there's that growing divergence, you have this plan, you insist on this plan, but everybody else starts to do something else. Okay? Then you ask the question, why? Why is it really now? Are we at that stage where this is an inflection point? And the third stage is trying to discern, okay, whether this newly emerging strategic picture and providing a framework in which the divergence can be combated and new strategic intent formulated. So the third stage means that you start to recognize and accept that, okay, this is going to be the new rules, okay? This is how it's gonna play right now, right? And you do something about it. Okay. So those are those three stages. The first stage, things happen, and then you notice that everybody seems to be doing their own thing, especially they do things that are not really aligned to what you have thought that should be the plan. And then the second stage would be really acknowledging that, okay, there's something there. What is it? Is it just a minor problem or is it really something very big? that's going to happen. And thirdly, when you do recognize that something big, what do I do about it? How do I close the divergence? How do I bridge the gap? Okay. And obviously, bridging the gap means that I have to do something new. Now, obviously, for us to be able to go through these three stages, there's a lot of things that need to happen, right? There's obviously debates, discussions, and I tell you, and I'm sure you have some of your own experiences. If ever you're faced with certain tensions, it's not going to be very comfortable. Sometimes you might even be viewed as the bad guy. And sometimes, yeah, nobody's going to agree with you, and don't take it personally. Okay? But other people sometimes they take it personally. But the whole point there is that the only way for you to come up with something concrete, okay, and a really good plan moving forward is to have some discussions about it. Okay, and discuss it broadly, discuss it with all the information available to you. Okay, and making sure that every voice is heard, so to speak, right? Making sure that whenever these discussions happen, there's diversity in the discussions. Now, just like everything else, this takes time. So don't expect to make things happen, which is kind of ironic, right? We acknowledge that there's dissonance, right? So the first thing that comes to my mind is I don't want to be dissonant. I want to make sure that whatever my intent is, it aligns with the action, right? As much as possible, you can think of it like real time. Like I can already determine right away, okay, this was happening in the market. The organization as a whole can really work towards it very quickly. So this is the idea of being lean and agile and robust. But the fact of the matter is that organizations, especially the bigger ones, they're not as agile as I think they are. The reality there is that organizational size is a function of, or it determines the ability for the organization to be agile. Okay? But regardless, even the smaller organizations, unless they've developed ways to be efficient in how things are run, okay, if there is going to be dissonance, it will take time for them to resolve the dissonance. Okay? So it will take time. Now, dealing with strategic dissonance, so associated with an inflection point, is a fundamental test of resilience of the culture and its leadership. And we've seen that not only in technology industries, right, but even in the more traditional industries, more traditional sectors. If ever that industry or sector is undergoing an industry shift, okay, and sometimes those who've been there, let's say, for hundreds of years, because they've been used to the idea this worked well for hundreds of years. So, this we've been there, we've seen it all, but then lo and behold, they didn't realize it was completely changing their landscape. They didn't respond. Okay, so that usually tests their culture and the leaders' ability to really shepherd the organization to newer pasture. And it does happen now, especially for high-tech industries. Yeah, do expect that leaders will be tested whenever strategic shifts happen. Now, one way for leaders to appreciate, okay, or really tackle the existence of strategic dissonance would be this particular analysis. Now, this seems to be like similar to what Porter has with the five forces, right? There's a little bit of variation. And although this was done in the mid-90s, so you can explain why, you can expect why it's sort of similar, but the whole idea here is that you can determine your situation, your position, and determining how much dissonance might exist. You can use this framework to actually help you answer those questions. Well, the first would be on the topmost. You can have the basis of competitive advantage in an industry. So that's one factor. In other words, the competition itself, right, has the basis of competitive advantage changed? Okay. Unlike before, the competitive advantage might be low cost, but this time around, it's completely different. So having a niche market. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing would be on the leftmost side would be your official corporate strategy. So what was the intent? What's the published intent? And on the rightmost side, you see your strategic action. So what are the things that have been done? And then the internal selection environment refers to everything that's happening within an organization. Okay. And lastly, the bottom part is the distinctive competence of the firm. So what they're really good at originally. So if you take a look at these five and then you start to understand okay, what these five elements are, they would give you some sort of an idea of whether or not the dissonance is going to be a problem or is going to be significant, and how much action is really needed to work out in order for you to close the dissonance. Now, from this framework, you can now determine what is known as sources of strategic dissonance. Okay, so one source would be that there is a divergence between the competitive advantage and what you have as far as your competencies go. So how does that work out? For example, the path to success in an industry is different from the skills or the talents or the resources that you have. That already is divergent, right? So that could be a source of strategic dissonance. But that doesn't happen overnight. Obviously, if you're a startup and you want to compete in an industry and you know that you don't have the skills, well, you don't compete right away. So this refers more to a situation wherein the status quo has changed and you didn't realize that the status quo really changed, that you yourself did not change. Okay, so that is a source of strategic dissonance. So what is another source of strategic dissonance? Well, we've said earlier, the stated strategy and what's happening inside the organization. What was published as the direction of the firm versus what's been happening, okay, as far as initiatives go within the organization. And lastly, the role of the internal selection environment, how things are decided, how decision-making happens. Okay? That is also a source of strategic dissonance. Now, you can look at this and really try to blow it up. Okay. Now that you know that where your possible sources of strategic dissonance are, right? So you know what the old is. You have more or less, okay, there's something wrong. Okay, so how do we carve a path forward? So this is what is known as your transformation process, okay, from the old to the new, which is very much similar to this schematic that you see on the board. I just blew it up. So you see those three concepts, those three notions. From the old or status quo way of doing things, you start to feel an inflection point. And that inflection point, if you zoom in, there are a lot of things that happen as to why there is an inflection point. That's your dissonance. And then based on the things that you unpack, okay, in understanding where the sources of dissonance come from, then you understand, okay, this is what I need to do. So that leads to your strategic recognition that, okay, this is my new way of doing things now. So this is like a very sketchy, or not really sketchy, but a caricature, more or less, of how an organization can move away from strategic dissonance. So it requires understanding the current, the old way of doing things, understanding that certain tensions and dissonances are happening at that moment, and understanding that from all of these things, understanding where the strategic dissonance is coming from, then understanding and deciding where to go next, which would then form your new set of strategic intent, strategic action, and everything else.